Dennis, congratulations on the forthcoming publication of your book, Statecraft and How to Restore America's Standing in the World. And thanks so much for contributing to TNR in the form of your new column and the many pieces that you've written for us over the course of the last year. You have a piece in the next issue of the magazine about Iran, and you propose a way for us to deal with Iran, short of dropping bombs on them, but quite more than sitting on our hands.
Right. Well, I think, when you're looking at a challenge, what's the first thing you have to do? You have to understand what the nature of the challenge is.
Mm-hmm.
Once you understand the nature of the challenge, you also have to be clear on what your objective is. I view statecraft and negotiations as having a lot in common.
Right.
Because the first thing you have to do if you're negotiating is, well, what is it you want?
Right.
You'd be amazed how often people go into negotiations and what you find out, certainly as a mediator, is they don't know what they want.
Right.
So you're helping them shape an objective. Well, first things first, what's your objective? How's your objective related to reality? How's your objective related to the challenge? In the case of Iran, we have an objective. We don't want Iran to be a nuclear armed power. If they become a nuclear weapon state, they change the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
They change the world.
Mm-hmm.
This isn't just about what happens to Israel. It's about if we no longer have a nuclear non-proliferation regime, we are living in a world that is vastly more dangerous. If we have a nuclear Middle East, we're living in a world where the prospect of a nuclear war goes up dramatically.
Right.
So we know that's where we start. So then the question is, all right, how do we get there?
Mm-hmm.
What are our points of leverage? Again, just like in negotiations, you want leverage.
Right.
Where do we have leverage to affect the situation? Well, let's take a look at where they have vulnerabilities. They have really very significant economic vulnerabilities. High inflation, high unemployment, a stock market that is basically collapsing.
Right.
Oil output that is dropping because their infrastructure is so dilapidated
Mm-hmm.
that in fact they can't produce the oil the way they could, they can't extract it from the ground the way they could.
Mm-hmm.
This is their main source of revenue, and their output's dropping at a time when their consumption's going up. They have to import 40% of their gasoline because they don't have refinery capacity. So, if they know they can be cut off from the international financial system, they got big problems.
Right.
So what I try to do is look at the vulnerabilities based on what the internal dynamic is with the Iranians, especially their leadership. I see one segment of the leadership loves confrontation, but the majority of the leadership does not. And they're aware of the cost of isolation.
We don't have that many economic levers that we can pull ourselves at this point, and it's up to us to convince the Europeans, the Japanese, the Saudis, other people to pull the levers that could inflict some damage on them. How do we get these other countries to do this dirty work for us?
The most important thing is always, again, focus on their interests as they define it. In the case of the Saudis look at an Iran with nuclear weapons almost as threatening as the Israelis do.
Right.
Because they look at Iran with a nuclear shield behind which they can coerce and subvert.
Mm-hmm.
At a time when they see a Sunni-Shia divide, when the Shia in Saudi Arabia all happen to be within their oil province.
Right.
So for them, an Iran that's on the march, and the image of Iran with nuclear weapons creates an image of being on the march,
Right.
an Iran that feels more self-confident, more assertive, more capable of being able to threaten without consequence,
Right.
becomes a threat to them.
So why haven't they, to this point, done more to penalize Iran economically?
I think because, in a sense, the Saudis have a history of when they deal with a problem,
Mm-hmm.
they look for ways of hedging bets,
Right.
not confronting. That's never been their style. It doesn't mean that they can't become more competitive. It doesn't mean that they're not prepared to be more competitive. But look at their behavior recently.
Mm-hmm.
Their behavior recently suggests a lot more hedging bets than confrontation.
That's how we can move the Saudis, but the Europeans seem to be. I mean, the Europeans. It seems like one minute they're taking this threat with the appropriate seriousness, and they understand that in a lot of ways Iran is more of a threat to them than it is to, say, the United States. But then in other moments, they seem to forget that and revert to a policy of just sitting on their hands. So how do you flip them?
I think the key thing is to play on what is ultimately their fear also.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, with allies, you can play upon what you have in common. You can also play upon where they have fears. From the European standpoint, they fear the use of force against Iran more than they fear an Iran with nuclear weapons.
Mm-hmm.
They fear a backlash throughout the Muslim world if force is used. They fear how it can be used by radical Islamicists to recruit. They fear
Right.
how it will create problems within their own Muslim populations. So there's a variety of factors that contribute to why they have this view. But if their view is use of force is worse than Iran with nuclear weapons, then you have to tell them, look, you're on a path where you're going to make force more likely.
Right.
If, from an Israeli standpoint, if the Israelis don't believe they can live with an Iran with nuclear weapons, not because they choose it that way, but because Iran has declared it.
Right.
The Iranian leadership, and even someone like Rafsanjani 3 years ago said, look, Israel can't, you hit Israel with one nuclear bomb and that's it for Israel.
Right.
Ahmadinejad says not just that they shouldn't exist, but that they won't exist.
Right.
And they pursue as nuclear weapons. So if you're Israel, you don't take this as only a rhetorical threat. You take it as an existential threat.
Because one bomb would destroy Israeli society. That would be
90% of the population is concentrated in
I mean, yeah, right.
So the point here is that from an Israeli standpoint, it's a real threat.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't think they can live with it. Now, if they come to the conclusion that the Europeans, whatever they say,
Yeah.
are prepared to live with it, you leave the Israelis no choice but to act militarily.
Right.
So one of the things you could do is encourage the Israelis, not publicly but privately, to go to the Europeans and say, don't put us in a position where we have no choice.
Well, thank you so much for the column and for the session.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks.